The FBI has retrieved new images from Nancy Guthrie's home security system. Footage from her front door camera, her driveway, and her backyard captured people and vehicles moving around her property in the days leading up to her disappearance. 2 photographs. Same masked man. Same front door. Same home. But something was off. On February 10, 2026, FBI Director Cash Patel went public with surveillance images pulled from Nancy Guthrie's Nest doorbell camera. The images showed a masked individual standing at her front door in the dead of night. Everyone watching assumed both photos were captured on the same evening, February 1, 2026, the night the 84-year-old woman was taken from her home in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood of Tucson, Arizona. But on February 23, sources with direct knowledge of the investigation spoke to CNN, and what they said cracked this case wide open. One of those photographs was not from February 1st. It was taken before, days before, possibly weeks before. The masked figure had already been there. He had stood at her door. He had studied that camera. He had memorized the layout of her porch, her entryway, her surroundings. And then he walked away. But he came back. The second time, he came with a backpack, a holstered weapon, and a plan that had been weeks in the making. Welcome back to Cold Case History. I am going to walk you through every detail of this case. The footage, the forensics, the suspect behavior, the DNA, and the digital evidence trail. If you are new here, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. We cover every update on cases like this one the moment they break. And trust me, this one is not finished breaking yet. Let's begin at the beginning. Nancy Guthrie is an 84-year-old woman who spent her life quietly in the Catalina Foothills area of Tucson, Arizona. This is a well-established residential community positioned against the Santa Catalina Mountains on the northern edge of the city. It is the kind of neighborhood that draws retirees and long-term residents who value seclusion, safety, and the particular stillness that comes from living close to open desert. The properties are set back from the road. The streets are calm. Neighbors tend to know each other. Strangers are noticed. And yet, something moved through this neighborhood undetected. Nancy is the mother of Savannah Guthrie, who has co-hosted NBC's Today Show since 2012 and has been one of the most recognized faces in American morning television for nearly 2 decades. That connection brought intense national media attention to this case the moment news of Nancy's disappearance broke. But Nancy Guthrie is not simply the mother of a famous person. She is a woman who raised 3 children, who built a life of her own in Tucson, who attended virtual church services nearly every single week without fail, and who was known in her community as gentle, devoted, and private. She was not a public figure. She was not someone who sought attention or lived in the spotlight. She was a grandmother, a churchgoer, a woman with deep roots in her neighborhood and her faith. She is also, by every clinical and legal standard, a medically vulnerable adult. Nancy relies on daily cardiac medication to manage a heart condition serious enough to require a pacemaker, a small device surgically implanted in her chest that continuously monitors and regulates her heartbeat. That pacemaker communicates wirelessly with an application on her Apple devices via Bluetooth. That connection, in the moment it went silent, would become one of the most critical pieces of forensic evidence in this entire investigation. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos, speaking at a press conference on February 3rd, made Nancy's physical limitations crystal clear to the public. He stated that she could not walk 50 yards on her own. She used a cane. The terrain surrounding her neighborhood, rugged desert with uneven ground, rocky washes, and thick brush, would have been physically impossible for her to navigate alone, especially in darkness. This was not a woman who wandered away from home in the middle of the night. This was not a case of confusion or disorientation. This was a woman who was deliberately removed from her home by someone who came prepared to take her. On the evening of January 31st, 2026, Nancy had dinner with family. It was an ordinary evening, the kind of shared meal that passes without ceremony in most households. After dinner, her son-in-law Tommaso Coyote, who was married to Savannah Guthrie, drove Nancy home and dropped her off at approximately 9:50 in the evening, Mountain Time. That was the last moment anyone publicly identified would confirm seeing Nancy Guthrie. Her home is a single-story residence in a gated community situated on a quiet cul-de-sac. Her neighbors are primarily retirees and families who chose that street specifically for its privacy and its sense of security. It is not the kind of street where unknown vehicles idle unnoticed. It is not the kind of community where someone lurks near a porch without raising concern. What happened next was captured not by human eyes, but by machines. The digital record of that night is precise and unrelenting, and each timestamp tells a piece of the story. At 1:47 in the morning on February 1st, Nancy's Nest doorbell camera was tampered with and forced offline. The footage captured before it went dark shows a masked figure reaching toward the lens, attempting to block its view. At 2:12 in the morning, a second camera on her property registered a motion event, but no corresponding footage was available. Investigators later confirmed that this camera had also been deliberately disabled. At 2:28 in the morning, Nancy's pacemaker application lost its Bluetooth connection to her Apple devices. That is the moment that matters most in the digital timeline. Because Bluetooth has a short range, measured in meters rather than miles, when that app went silent, it meant Nancy was no longer inside her home or anywhere near it. She had been taken from the house. At 2:36 in the morning, a Ring camera at a neighbor's property roughly 2.5 miles away recorded a vehicle moving through the neighborhood at a speed that was noticeably high for a residential street in the early hours of the morning. At around noon on February 1st, Nancy failed to appear for her weekly virtual church service. She had not missed it in recent memory. Family members began trying to reach her. When she did not respond, they drove to her home. The front door was unlocked. Her phone was inside. Her daily medication, the medication she needed to function, was sitting on the counter untouched. And on the front porch, there was blood. DNA testing confirmed it was Nancy's. It was fresh. It indicated a struggle, a fall, or an act of violence that had taken place during the abduction. The FBI was notified immediately. Within hours, the Catalina Foothills neighborhood was surrounded by local, state, and federal investigators. Drones swept the desert terrain. Search teams went out on foot and on horseback. Sniffer dogs worked the area. Helicopters moved overhead in a grid pattern. Nancy Guthrie was not found. The FBI released surveillance footage showing the masked figure at her doorbell camera in the early hours of February 1st. The figure wore gloves and a ski mask. He carried a black backpack that investigators identified as a 25-liter Ozark Trail hiker pack sold exclusively at Walmart. That identification triggered an immediate outreach to Walmart corporate to identify recent purchases of that specific item in the Tucson region and surrounding areas. The figure also had a gun holstered near the center of his waistline, an unusual position that drew immediate attention from firearms specialists. Standard carry positions sit on the dominant hip or in the appendix position slightly to the side. A center waist holster suggests either tactical training or a very deliberate personal preference, and that detail immediately began narrowing the field of who investigators were looking for. The backpack had reflective strips on the straps designed to increase visibility for hikers in low light conditions. Those reflective straps appeared clearly in the night vision footage and became one of the most identifiable visual features of the suspect. FBI examiners built a blackout tent at the property on February 12th, recreating the nighttime lighting conditions from the doorbell footage using replica clothing and an identical backpack to make accurate measurements. Their analysis placed the suspect at approximately 5 feet 9 to 5 feet 10 inches tall, with an average build. The Guthrie family was formally cleared as suspects on February 16th. Sheriff Nanos issued a public statement making that determination unambiguous, calling any suggestion of family involvement cruel and without basis. But among all the images Director Patel posted to social media on February 10th, one image quietly stood apart. In that photograph, the same masked figure appeared at the same front door. Same mask, same gloves, same posture. But in this image, there was no backpack, and there was no gun holster. For nearly 2 weeks, that detail went largely unremarked. The public, the press, and many investigators assumed all the released images came from the same night. It was a reasonable conclusion. The FBI's framing of the release suggested as much. But that assumption was wrong. And when the truth emerged, it reframed the entire case. On February 23, 2026, CNN published a report that fundamentally changed how investigators and the public understood what had happened to Nancy Guthrie. A source with direct knowledge of the investigation told CNN that the images released by the FBI were captured on 2 separate days, not just the morning of February 1st when authorities believed the abduction occurred. The source was specific. The image showing the suspect without a backpack and without a holster was not from the night Nancy disappeared. It was taken by her Nest doorbell camera on a date prior to February 1st, days before, possibly weeks before. The suspect had come to her door more than once. ABC News published a similar account, citing their own independent sources. CBS News confirmed the detail with a separate law enforcement contact. Newsweek published a thorough analysis that included commentary from retired FBI agents. Fox News covered the revelation across multiple broadcasts. This was not a single unnamed source making a speculative claim. This was multiple verified national news organizations, each with independent confirmation, all landing on the same conclusion. The masked man had visited Nancy Guthrie's home before the night he took her. CNN's chief law enforcement and intelligence analyst, John Miller, a former senior FBI official with decades of experience across counterterrorism and major criminal investigations, explained the full significance of what that earlier visit meant. He described the pre-February 1st appearance as fitting a pattern of pre-operational surveillance and reconnaissance, language with precise meaning in law enforcement circles. Pre-operational surveillance is the phase where a perpetrator gathers intelligence on a target before committing the crime. Reconnaissance is the physical act of visiting a location to map its vulnerabilities, understand its camera positions, learn its blind spots, and identify the optimal moment to act. Former FBI agent Jason Pack, who worked violent crime and kidnapping investigations during his career, told ABC News that if it is the same person in both images, and investigators believe it is, it points to someone who was studying the location before making their move. He emphasized that the presence of preparation transforms the nature of the crime, elevating it from opportunistic to calculated, from impulsive to deliberately engineered. Jennifer Coffindaffer, a former FBI agent with 25 years of experience who now provides expert analysis on high-profile cases, was direct on social media. She called the revelation enormous. 2 photographs, 2 different days. She said that anyone still entertaining the idea that this was a burglary gone wrong needed to let that theory go entirely. He cased the place. He intended to take Nancy. The premeditation is beyond question. The implications radiate outward from that single discovery in every direction. Random criminals do not conduct reconnaissance. Opportunistic offenders do not return to a target on multiple occasions before making their move. This level of planning implies a connection, however distant, between the suspect and Nancy Guthrie herself, or between the suspect and someone in her orbit. It implies knowledge of her routine, her isolation, her physical vulnerability, and the layout of her property. It raises a direct question that investigators are now asking with new urgency. Who knew enough about Nancy Guthrie to plan this? Who knew she lived alone? Who knew about her cardiac condition and her reliance on daily medication? Who knew her daughter was one of the most prominent television journalists in the country? Who had access to her address, her schedule, her daily patterns? The investigation shifted from identifying the person captured on February 1st to mapping the full window of the suspect's activity in the weeks and possibly months before Nancy disappeared. If you're still here, subscribe because cases like this only work when people stay. And tell us where you're watching from. I love seeing my global family represent. Drop your country or city in the comments. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos responded to CNN's February 23rd report on the same day it was published. Speaking to CBS News directly, he stated that the information suggesting the images were taken on different days did not originate from the FBI or from his department. That same evening, the sheriff's office released a formal written statement acknowledging that images of the suspect showed him in different states of attire, with and without a backpack. But the statement inserted a significant qualifier. There is no date or time stamp associated with these images, the statement read, and therefore any suggestion that the photographs were taken on different days is purely speculative. The investigation will be guided by verifiable evidence and established facts. Sheriff Nanos repeated this position the following morning in an interview on the Today Show, the same program where Savannah Guthrie had co-anchored alongside her colleagues before her mother's disappearance upended everything. This created a visible tension between the official public posture of the Pima County Sheriff's Department and the reporting of multiple credible national news organizations citing independent law enforcement sources. How do we make sense of that tension? The answer lies in how digital forensic data is handled and how it is presented. Modern Nest doorbell cameras, like most smart home devices operating in the current generation of connected technology, store footage in 2 places simultaneously. The footage is saved locally on the device, but it is also uploaded automatically to cloud servers managed by Google, which owns Nest, in real time, as long as the device maintains an internet connection. The physical camera at Nancy's home was removed by the suspect, likely in a deliberate attempt to destroy evidence. It was a logical move from the perspective of someone trying to eliminate their tracks, but it was also a critical miscalculation, because the footage that had already been uploaded to Google's cloud servers before the camera was taken offline remained intact and fully recoverable. Investigators were able to work with Google to access that archived data. When image files are recovered from cloud servers, particularly when the physical device has been tampered with or removed, the timestamp metadata may not appear embedded within the visible image file as it would in a standard photograph. A journalist, a member of the public, or even a law enforcement officer viewing the image as a standard file might not see a date or timestamp displayed on the image itself. The sheriff's public statement was therefore technically accurate in what it described. The images released to the public did not display visible timestamps. But that statement does not mean timestamps do not exist in the underlying data. Investigators with access to Google's raw server records can retrieve the precise moment each frame was captured, down to the second. And according to the sources who have seen that data, those timestamps place the images on separate days. Analysts who have closely followed the case have offered a compelling theory about why the earlier visit may have been kept confidential. Investigators may have strategically withheld that detail to allow the suspect to believe that authorities were only aware of his February 1st appearance. If he believed the investigation was limited to that single night, he might behave differently than if he knew investigators were reconstructing a weeks-long pattern of surveillance. That strategy, if it existed, was disrupted when FBI Director Cash Patel posted the images publicly on social media. CNN reported that investigators on the ground in Tucson were caught off guard by the public release. A source told CNN that local and federal authorities had been operating under the assumption that certain details of the earlier visit would remain confidential while they continued building their case. The first visit tells us something precise about who this person is and how he thinks. When the masked figure stood at Nancy's front door on that earlier occasion, without the backpack, without the weapon, he was not committing a crime yet. He was gathering information. He was positioning himself in front of the camera to understand exactly what it captured, where its field of view began and ended, whether it had night vision capability, whether the lens angle could be obscured from a particular position, and whether the motion detection triggered an alert to Nancy's phone. He was testing her response. Would she check the app? Would she open the door? Would she call the police? He was evaluating how long he could stand there before anything happened. He was studying the landscaping around the entryway, noting the shrubbery that could be used to block the lens if needed. He was mapping the darkness around the porch, identifying the pockets of shadow where his approach would be least visible to neighbors or passing vehicles. This is the work of someone who plans. History offers chilling precedent for this pattern. Bryan Kohberger, the former criminology PhD student charged with the murders of 4 University of Idaho students in November 2022, drove past the victim's off-campus house in Moscow, Idaho, at least 12 separate times in the weeks before the killings, according to cell phone location data and surveillance footage analyzed by investigators. His white Hyundai Elantra was documented circling the neighborhood repeatedly before November 13, 2022, the night Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogan, Xana Kernadal, and Ethan Chapin were stabbed to death in their beds. Kohberger studied that house. He mapped the neighborhood. He established the residents' patterns of movement. And when he decided the time was right, he entered through a sliding glass door and committed the murders. He left behind a knife sheath. The DNA on that sheath, processed through investigative genetic genealogy, led to his identification and arrest 6 weeks after the crime. On July 2, 2025, Kohberger pleaded guilty to all 4 counts of first-degree murder. On July 23, 2025, he was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Joseph James DeAngelo, the man identified in 2018 as the Golden State Killer, operated on a similar principle of pre-crime infiltration taken to an even more methodical extreme. DeAngelo is known to have broken into homes weeks before attacking, moving objects to see if residents would notice his presence. He would enter through unlocked windows in the middle of the night, move through bedrooms, and leave subtle signs that he had been there. If residents detected the disturbance and reported it or changed their locks, he moved on to a different target. If residents failed to notice, he cataloged them as unobservant and vulnerable, and he returned when he was ready. DeAngelo committed at least 13 murders and more than 50 sexual assaults across California between 1974 and 1986, evading capture for more than 3 decades not through luck, but through extreme patience and systematic planning. In 2018, investigators uploaded a DNA profile from his crime scenes to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database. The upload returned matches with distant relatives. Genealogists built outward from those matches, working through public records, census data, obituaries, birth and death certificates, and family histories to construct a family tree that narrowed progressively until it pointed toward a small group of candidates. Investigators obtained a discarded item from DeAngelo's trash, confirmed the DNA match, and arrested him in April 2018. He later pleaded guilty to multiple counts of murder and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The forensic methodology that brought him to justice is the same methodology now being applied to the DNA recovered from Nancy Guthrie's home. Understanding what that first visit gave the suspect helps explain everything he did differently on February 1st. The reconnaissance visit gave him the camera's exact position and field of view. It gave him knowledge of the shrubbery near the porch that could be used as an improvised obstruction. It gave him the optimal time window when neighbors slept and the street was empty. It gave him Nancy's response pattern, or more precisely, the absence of one. There is no public record of a 911 call from Nancy's address in the weeks before her disappearance. There is no documented report of a suspicious person at her door. If she saw an alert from the first visit and dismissed it, if she thought it was a delivery driver or a wrong address, the suspect would have observed that inaction and treated it as confirmation that he could return without triggering an alarm. The second visit was not an improvisation. Every decision was already made. At 1:47 in the morning on February 1st, he came back. This time, the backpack was on his shoulders. The gun was holstered at his waist. The gloves were on his hands. He stood at the door, reached up, and attempted to cover the Nest camera lens with his gloved hand. When partial images continued to be captured, he stepped off the porch, bent down, grabbed shrubbery from the landscaping near the entryway, the same landscaping he had evaluated on his earlier visit, and used it to block the camera more effectively. He had already identified that exact spot on his first trip. He knew it was there. He knew it would work. The camera went dark. By 2:28 in the morning, 41 minutes after the camera was taken offline, Nancy's pacemaker application lost its Bluetooth signal to her home devices. She was no longer in the house. By 2:36, just 8 minutes after the pacemaker signal dropped, a Ring camera 2.5 miles away captured a vehicle moving through the neighborhood at a speed inconsistent with ordinary late-night residential traffic. 8 minutes. That is how quickly she was gone. In the days following Nancy's disappearance, investigators made a targeted request to residents in the surrounding neighborhood. They asked for surveillance footage from two specific time windows. The first was January 11, 2026, between 9 in the evening and midnight. The second was January 31st, between 9:30 and 11 in the evening. At the time, the January 11th request seemed puzzling. That date sits 3 weeks before Nancy was taken, and no public explanation was given for why investigators were focused on it. But in light of the February 23rd reporting, a clear picture begins to emerge. Investigators may have already identified suspicious activity from January 11th in footage retrieved from nearby cameras. A vehicle that didn't belong, a figure seen near Nancy's property, a movement pattern that matched what they were looking for. That January 11th date may mark the first reconnaissance visit. The 3-week gap between January 11th and February 1st speaks to patience. It speaks to someone who was not acting impulsively, who waited, who watched, who chose the exact right conditions before returning to complete what he had planned. Investigators have also worked their way methodically through Tucson's gun shop community. The center-waist holster worn by the suspect is an unusual carrying choice, as Sheriff Nanos publicly noted. That positioning requires either a specific type of tactical holster or considerable comfort with non-standard carrying configurations, suggesting training of some kind, whether military, law enforcement, or advanced civilian firearms coursework. The FBI visited gun shops across the Tucson area approximately a week after the surveillance images were released, showing shop owners photographs of various individuals and asking whether any of them matched recent customers. One shop owner confirmed to CNN that FBI agents came in with a series of images for identification review. Another told a CNN affiliate that an agent asked him to cross-reference between 18 and 24 names and images against his records of recent gun and equipment purchases. He searched the shop's database and found no matches. The investigation is working outward from every angle simultaneously. DNA was recovered from inside Nancy Guthrie's home. Sheriff Nanos confirmed publicly that this DNA does not belong to Nancy, does not match any member of her family, and does not match anyone with legitimate access to her property. It belongs to an unknown male. That profile was submitted to CODIS, the FBI-managed combined DNA index system, which houses more than 19 million offender profiles collected from individuals convicted of qualifying offenses across the country. The search returned no hit. The suspect is not in the database. He has no prior criminal conviction that required a DNA sample submission. This is simultaneously frustrating and informative. It forecloses the fastest path to identification, but it tells investigators something meaningful about who they are dealing with. This person, whatever he has done before in his life, has either never been caught or has never been convicted of a crime serious enough to place him in the system. Sheriff Nanos confirmed that investigators are pursuing investigative genetic genealogy as the next phase of the DNA analysis. This technique goes far beyond the standard CODIS search. Rather than looking for a direct match among known offenders, Investigative genetic genealogy analyzes hundreds of thousands of genetic markers across the full genome of the forensic sample and uploads that comprehensive profile to public genealogy databases such as GeneMatch and Family Tree DNA, which have agreements in place to assist law enforcement. The system searches for anyone who shares any detectable genetic overlap with the unknown profile, third cousins, fourth cousins, fifth cousins, individuals who may share as little as 1% of their DNA with the suspect. Each match becomes the starting point for a family tree. Genealogists work forward and backward through the branches, pulling in public records, historical documents, census data, marriage and death certificates, and decades of family history until the field of candidates narrows from thousands to dozens to a handful to one. At that point, investigators move to covert confirmation. They collect a discarded item from the candidate's environment, something left in public, a coffee cup, a cigarette, a tissue. The DNA from that item is tested against the crime scene profile. If it matches, the case breaks open. This is exactly how the Golden State Killer was identified after 32 years of freedom. This is exactly how Bryan Kohberger was connected to the Idaho murders. And this is the road investigators are now walking in the search for Nancy Guthrie. A glove was recovered during the search operation approximately 2 miles from Nancy's home. It appeared visually consistent with the gloves worn by the suspect in the doorbell footage. DNA from that glove was tested. On March 5, 2026, the Pima County Sheriff's Department announced the result. The DNA from the glove belonged to a local restaurant worker who had no connection to the case, a person who had been in the search area during the active investigation and had inadvertently left behind the glove. It was a dead end. Approximately 16 gloves in total were collected across the search area. The majority were traced back to members of the search teams themselves. The DNA that matters, the DNA investigators believe belongs to the person who entered Nancy's home, is the sample recovered from inside the house, and it is still being processed. On March 5, 2026, Savannah Guthrie made her first return to 30 Rockefeller Plaza since her mother's disappearance, walking into Studio 1A to see her colleagues at the Today Show. She did not return to air. She did not sit in her chair or resume her role as co-host. She came to be with the people who had been holding things together in her absence and to tell them what her presence in that building meant to her. A source who was present told CNN that Savannah thanked her team for caring about her mother as deeply as they had. She told them she intended to come back, but that she did not yet know how to take that step, and she also did not know how to stay away because the show and the people in it had become family to her. She told them she was still standing. She said she still had hope. She said she was still herself. NBC released a statement in the days following confirming that Savannah plans to return to the broadcast, but that she remains focused on her family and on doing everything possible to help bring Nancy home. The Today Show set has been filled with yellow flowers. Outside Nancy's home in the Catalina Foothills, yellow ribbons have been tied to trees. Cards and handwritten notes from people across the country rest against the gate of her property. Bouquets brought by strangers sit at the foot of the fence. Yellow is the color of missing persons awareness. It is the color of refusal to stop looking. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She has a pacemaker. She requires daily cardiac medication to keep her heart regulated. She cannot walk 50 yards without a cane. She has been gone for more than 40 days. And the person who took her is still unidentified. A 5-person dedicated task force, for detectives and a sergeant from the Pima County Sheriff's Department, has been embedded at the FBI's Tucson field office to work exclusively on this case. A combined reward of $1.2 million remains active, including $1 million contributed by the Guthrie family, $100,000 from the FBI, and additional funds through Crime Stoppers. It is among the largest rewards ever offered for a missing person case in Arizona's history. More than 19,000 tips have been submitted to the FBI's National Threat Operations Center through the 1-800-CALL FBI line and the online portal at tips.fbi.gov. Each tip is being reviewed, assessed, and either pursued or eliminated. Investigators are sorting through that volume looking for the details that connect, the verifiable observations, the names that recur, the vehicles seen near Nancy's street in January, the faces that don't belong. And somewhere inside that data, somewhere within the thousands of hours of neighborhood footage being reviewed, somewhere within the DNA being mapped through genealogical databases, somewhere within the metadata attached to those cloud-archived images, there is a thread that leads back to the man who stood at her door. He believed the darkness and the mask would be enough to disappear behind. He was wrong. He appeared on camera not once, but multiple times. He left biological evidence inside the home of the woman he took. He created a digital footprint across multiple devices, multiple cloud archives, multiple neighbor cameras, and multiple timestamps. He stood in front of a recording device on a night before he even committed the crime. Every visit is another opportunity. Every frame is another data point. Every piece of DNA is another branch on a family tree that investigators are already building. The investigation is not stalled. It is compressing. The timeline is being reconstructed minute by minute. The DNA is being run through the most advanced forensic genealogy available. The surveillance footage is being analyzed frame by frame in controlled environments designed to extract every possible detail. The tips are being cross-referenced and filtered, and the behavioral profile of a man who planned for weeks, who scouted the property, who studied the camera, who waited for the right moment, and who came back ready. That profile is being matched against names and faces in the world that investigators are quietly closing in on. Nancy Guthrie deserves to come home. If this case has reached you, if it has stayed with you the way it has stayed with investigators and with the family who placed yellow ribbons on those desert trees, then do something with that feeling right now. Subscribe to Cold Case History. Hit the notification bell. The moment new evidence breaks in this case, new surveillance details, new forensic results, new tips confirmed, we will be here covering it with the same depth and the same precision we brought to this video. We do not move on when cases fade from the headlines. We keep going until there are answers. If you have seen anything relevant to this case, if you live in the Tucson area and observed unusual activity near the Catalina Foothills neighborhood in January or early February 2026, call the FBI tip line at 1-800-CALL-FBI. You can reach the Pima County Sheriff's Department directly at 520-351-4900. You can submit tips online, anonymously if you prefer, at tips.fbi.gov. A $1.2 million reward remains on the table for information that leads to Nancy's recovery. Every detail matters. Every tip matters. Every person watching this video who shares it with someone else is another set of eyes on the face of a man who thought he had disappeared into the dark. He is not. Nancy Guthrie is still waiting. And we are not done looking.